So this is episode 4.
Wait, what are we talking about?
I don't know. We haven't done the intro yet. Let's do the intro, then we'll get into what we're talking about.
Okay.
So episode number 4. Do we have a name of this podcast yet?
It's called the EmberMap podcast. We actually have cover art. We're on iTunes.
Whoa, when did all this happen?
Welcome to episode 4 of the EmberMap podcast. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And we're here to talk about Ember.
Nice. So what kind of Ember code did you work on this week?
What Ember code did I work on? I have been working on profiler application that we've been working on the last few months. And I was doing some design mostly, actually, and some form stuff. Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, I'm working on an application. I've been doing a bunch of login stuff, a bunch of authentication, using JWT tokens, which I've learned a lot about in the past week or so. So yeah, it's been fun. It's been exciting.
Nice. Yeah, one thing that strikes me is just how difficult forms still are at a high level, you know? In Ember, but even, something that's been worked on for so long, you would think would be completely well understood. Everyone would be doing forms the same way. And that's not true. That's not even true for us across different apps, at the details of it.
I think in like a server-side application, your forms, there's not multiple states, right? You're filling out a form, you click submit, and if there's like a validation error, the server re-renders the form. So you always have like a clean state. Every render is always a clean state of the form, even if there are validation errors. Where when we build forms with Ember apps, we're doing live validation. Sometimes we delay validation to the input blurring out or the form being submitted. Sometimes you have a validation error. You tear down the component, you re-render the component. Do you save that state? Do you roll back the attributes? And I think there's a lot more. Forms in a server-driven error, I think are pretty straightforward. But
there's one state. You can describe the form with a single piece of state, basically. It's like the URL and the current state of the user. But then, maybe that's why they're so hard, is because there is so much state that leaks into those forms. Like that affects the forms, right? It's like you were saying, blurring. Have I hit enter? Am I authenticated? Has any of that data changed? And if so, like the form, is it currently rendered to the screen, and does it need to refresh in some way? We've done things where you have to like create a user and then create an address or like some other model all within the sign up form. And it's like, now you have, that's even harder because that goes back to like transactions and stuff like this.
That's another really good point. In a server driven world, you are filling out an input that's going to be used in a post request. But in Ember, we're binding our forms to models, usually multiple models. So like, you have a user has many addresses, and you're adding multiple addresses to that user. So you don't just have a bunch of inputs that are going to show up in a post request. They're inputs that are bound to different models.
Or you have to like make a get request to something. Or go to Stripe to make a request before completing the form. And it's like the server is good about encapsulating all that. And from the browser to server's perspective, it's like one request. But with Ember, it could be, now Ember's managing all that complexity, and it could be going lots of different ways. And then every time you add a new path, you like multiply the amount of states this thing can be in. And it's so easy not to think about it. So it's tough.
Yeah. So have you done anything recently that makes forms easier?
So one thing that we've been doing, first with EmberMap and then on some client projects, is basically trying to take some of those nice patterns from Rails Form 4, from other libraries we've seen in like the Ember ecosystem, the React ecosystem, and basically, I think it comes back to this discussion about state, and the idea being, okay, forms interact with state a lot, and they are derived from state, like the visual representation is derived from all the state. So let's take all that state as like a bag, tie it to the form, and then share it with all the different components that make up your actual form. So, if you think about like a form group and a form field and a label, all these things can change based on the state of the form. So whether the user has submitted it, whether a client-side validation failed, whether a server-side validation failed. And so something that I've found that's like really cleaned things up is having like a UI form component, let's say at the top of the tree, and basically delegating all of the state changes to that component. And then that component can yield back down useful information to all the other subcomponents. So things like, again, the validation state and all this kind of stuff. And then from the consumer's perspective, you can just render, like a form field or an input, and you can tie it back to a field on a model. And again, the UI form is like aware of the model. It's aware of how the fields tie back to validations on the model and all this kind of thing. So that's, again, we haven't gotten to the point where it's like a totally generic solution, but I find making something like this tree of components for a specific use case has been like the best way to help reduce the complexity.
And we use contextual components to pass data between these things. So it's use a user, use a developer making a form. You're not thinking of how does data flow from this root form element down to the child elements.
Exactly.
And maybe something we can do is we'll throw up a screenshot of some of our forms, and you can kind of see the abstraction with the form tag and then the various types of inputs we use.
That's a great idea. Yeah. And this, when we were talking about this, like one thing that would make building these kinds of components way easier would be to have like splats and named blocks. It's like a couple pieces that are making it hard, because let's say you have like a big form or a multi-part form, but you do have that root UI form component, and you want to be able to maybe even want to break up your actual form into other components themselves just to help manage the complexity. But you want to always be in the context of that parent form, and then it becomes hard to actually do that. It's like you have a hash of things that you've yielded, how to pass that around, how to make that available to everybody. It actually turns out to be pretty tough.
Yep.
And I think splat arguments and named blocks would help with these kinds of things. Also with like modals, there's a couple of these kinds of UI components that come up time and time again. And I think if we had those missing pieces, we'd be able to make them in a truly reusable, truly generic way that would solve like all of our use cases.
Nice.
So yeah, let's talk about login.
Yeah. So I've been working on some login pieces for an application, and there's an interesting bit here where the application uses JWT, JSON Web Tokens, to authenticate the user. And this application is a private application. It's not a public application, so we don't want to load the application to any user on the internet. So there's a whole bunch of auth before you can even get to the Ember application. So once you've loaded the Ember application, you're already authed. But the Ember application doesn't know that, right? Like the Ember application just renders and it boots up. It needs to know who you are, how you're authed. So the system we came up with is there's a cookie. There's a cookie. It says who you are. It says what your JSON Web Token is. It has a whole bunch of information about the user that's loading the Ember application. And this works well. But there's a
So can you talk a little bit about JSON Web Token, because I don't have a lot of experience with it.
Yeah, sure.
Just briefly, kind of what it is, because I'm more used to dealing with kind of browser sessions.
Absolutely. So JSON Web Token is a way to encode authentication information in a JSON payload, encode it into a string so that the browser can use that string with every request. So the string is structured into like 3 pieces. There's like the JSON payload, a signed secret of the JSON payload, and there's something else I'm not remembering that's included in there.
Gotcha. But it's just a JSON object, just like would come back and forth from normal AJAX requests.
Yeah, it is. So JWT is an encoded version of that JSON object. So it's a string. But when you decode it, you would see a JSON object in one of the pieces. The whole point of JWT is that you have this payload that you send to all your requests to the server, and that way the server knows who you are. And part of the JWT is who you are, and then something that the server signs. So when the server gets the token, it can quickly verify the payload you're sending with the thing that it signed. And if those things match, it knows that the token you sent over was valid. Rails and Devise do something similar with a session cookie. I think one of the benefits of JWT is that it's not built into like a cookie or the session. So
which
you
is
can
specific to a browser.
Exactly. So JWT, if you're building like an API that needs to work on mobile apps and Ember apps, JWT is kind of the one system that will bridge both of those.
Gotcha. So that's what you were working on. So back to your story, you were saying you use JWT. So like you were just explaining, that will kind of authenticate every request that the Ember app will make during the session that the user's using it, but it doesn't actually log in the user.
Correct. So the typical JWT workflow would be I come to a site, I get a form with username and password, I fill out those fields, I submit the form, and the server responds with a JWT that I can then use in all my future requests.
Gotcha.
But with this application, we're saying that this application is private. The user's already going to be authenticated before they load the Ember app. Like they've already gone through the login process, and now they're ending up on the Ember app, and they are logged in. So we don't want to present them with another form in the Ember app that says enter your username and password, because that would be super annoying to have to enter your username and password twice. So we need some way of getting that token to the Ember app, because we're not going to ask the user to enter the username and password. So what we decided on was we were going to use a cookie for the browser use case, because it's an Ember app.
And that will come over with the index HTML file?
Exactly. That will come over with the index.html file. And then the Ember app will read that cookie and then say, okay, any Ember data requests I make, I'm going to use this token. So there's an interesting thing. You're developing an Ember app. How do you set a cookie with your index.html? Because that thing is served from Ember CLI. And Ember they have a server.
So you're talking now about local development. You're just trying to build this thing out.
I'm trying to build
this. The server
this.
doesn't exist right now, and you just want to work on it.
Exactly. I have a development environment, and I want to serve, I want my development environment to be as close to production as possible.
Right.
So production is saying that when we serve that HTML file, there's going to be a cookie that says who the user is. I want my development environment to match that.
Nice.
And there is Ember CLI uses Express to serve the index.html file. And you can use a Ember CLI generator called Server, and you can hook into that Express app. So we have you type Ember.g server index, and it basically gives you an Express middleware. And in that, I say, okay, if I'm serving the index.html, I'm going to add a cookie. And the awesome thing is this is Node. It's Express. So I have some stuff in there where I added JWT. I generated JWT token when I'm developing the app. So every time Ember CLI live reloads, I get a brand new JWT token.
And you're using like Node packages.
Yeah, I'm using
Node
Node packages.
So it's actually like a legitimate
It's
token.
It's not just some like cached thing. It's a legitimate token.
And it's coming over the network because
Exactly.
It's actually coming as a cookie in the actual HTTP response.
So development is super close to what production will be like.
That's awesome. And the way you hook into the server, you're hooking into the flow of middleware that starts with basically the result of the broccoli build and gets served up, but you're not affecting any of that. You're just like tagging on the end of that.
Yeah, exactly. So when your browser makes a request to like localhost 4200/index.html, I'm able to intercept that request and add things to it.
Nice.
So this is pretty powerful. I mean, you could like rewrite the index, or you could change other headers. I'm just using it to add a cookie.
Right.
That's gonna, tell the Ember app who the user is.
But basically, if you ever have to deal with things at the request layer that you want to mimic the production environment, that's how you would do it.
Exactly.
And now that's part of the repository that will be committed as part of the source code. So
any developer that's running Ember Serve is going to have all this functionality.
That's awesome. So they don't have to set any other services up on their computer or anything like that.
Exactly. So if you have like a complex, production environment, which most Ember apps do,
right?
This is a way where you can add more server pieces.
Right.
So yeah, this is great. I love this. It makes development super easy.
That's really cool. Now, what about testing?
So testing, we won't use this Express middleware. But what I do in testing is, like I said, the contract is when the Ember app boots up, it's going to read from a few cookies, figure out who the user is. So I have a before each in one of my tests. So, my tests that want to make sure that I'm a valid user, I just set up a bunch of cookies in before each, and then I destroy them in after each. So you can do that. Like in testing, we don't, when we're testing applications, it's not about building out the same infrastructure. Things like cookies, we're going to expect to be working.
Right.
Things like the server, the server serving a cookie, we're going to expect to be working. So it's about, mocking at the boundaries.
The application code that interacts with the cookie.
So just saying, okay, pretend there's a cookie here, set that up in before each, get rid of it in after each.
Nice.
So it makes a test. Testing, we're not testing the whole environment, we're just testing the Ember bits. And so
the boundaries we're responsible for.
And the boundary is a cookie. We don't care how the cookie got there.
But that still lets you set a valid cookie and then assert against what the Ember app does, and then an invalid cookie and assert against what the Ember app does. Nice.
Exactly.
Cool. That's really cool.
And maybe this is another good screenshot. We'll show that while we're talking about this. We'll show the Express middleware.
Nice. Yeah, so did you see on Twitter the Matt Beal wrote a blog post about Ember 3.0?
Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah.
Really, really exciting.
Yeah. Robert Jackson told me there was never going to be an Ember 3 like 6 months ago. So that just goes to show you how much you can trust that guy.
I'm pretty sure that half the Ember code in production that we have is add-ons written by that guy.
That's true. That's true. We owe him something.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? So how does, you've been a Rails developer longer than I have. You've worked at companies that have gone through major Rails releases. And, I think the Ember community takes a lot after some of those kind of the conventions and the practices established by the Rail community when it comes to things like release and all this. So how did that strike you when you read through this, how it compares to that?
Yeah, so I would say, the difference between a major Ember release and a major Rails release, they couldn't be more different. In Rails releases between 4.2 and 5.0, or 3.2 and 4.0, that's when all these big things come in, the new APIs, the new features.
So 5.0 had action cable.
Action cable, yep. So the big new exciting things come out with the major versions. And there's always a big upgrade guide. The Rails team does a great job documenting this, but there's always a big upgrade guide that you have to follow when you're going between major versions of Rails.
You can't let your test suite plus deprecations guide you.
I've never had just
a seamless upgrade.
You can let your test suite guide you, but when you bump from Rails 4.2 to 5.0, you'll have failing tests.
Gotcha. So you're just going to expect time to upgrade.
Right. Or you'll at least have deprecations and tests. You'll have something that it won't be seamless. You'll have work to do. Now I've upgraded plenty of apps from, starting all the way at 3.0, 2.1, all the way up to where we are today.
Yeah. So it's possible.
Rails
make
is
it
great.
They give you they make a big effort to make it possible and easy enough.
But just to be clear, with Rails, the big stuff comes in the major versions. So
how does that compare to Ember?
Yeah. So to Ember, we were looking at these 3.0, release notes, what's going to change. And Ember doesn't add any new stuff in the major versions. The major versions they use the major versions to take all the deprecations that were previously added and remove that code.
Just get rid of the cruft.
So right now in our code, two of our code bases, we have no deprecations.
So if 3.0 came out tomorrow, we'd be able to get on Ember 3.0.
Yep,
which
exactly.
is pretty crazy. That means we're kind of doing best practices. We're doing what the community would like to see, how the community would like to see people writing Ember apps today.
Exactly. And a lot of the deprecations that 3.0 is going to remove, basically get rid of the code, they're probably deprecations you've already fixed. I mean, there are deprecations in there that we had fixed over a year ago.
Yeah.
So if you've been, doing a decent job of keeping an eye on deprecation warnings in your Ember app, you're going to have no problem upgrading.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. I actually thought that we were going to have something interesting to talk about. What are we going to do about this in 3.0 and how are we going to handle this?
How are we going to tell people to set aside 3 weeks to fix their apps or upgrade their apps or whatever?
But we're not. I looked through the deprecations and I was like, yeah, I think we took care of that one like 9 months ago.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I'm expecting smooth sailing there.
That's great. Yeah, and they talked about, learning a lot from the 1 to 2 upgrade and not trying to sneak in a bunch of stuff at the end. It feels like they have kind of a regular cadence now so that no one's going to feel like they have to sneak something in to get a feature on.
Yeah, and when you say sneak something in, when they upgraded, when we went from 1.13 to 2.0, they added a whole bunch of deprecations in like 1.11, 1.12, 1.13 so that they could then clear all that stuff out in 2.0. But yeah, we haven't seen any new deprecations coming in the latest versions.
Right.
So, and I think they realized that, a lot of people were, found that process difficult.
Right.
So yeah, I think, this is probably the most boring major upgrade that we'll do. And that's totally awesome.
Yeah. And then the new features that people are working on, they could land before there'll be some of them that will land before 3.0. Some that will land after, but they're basically not even tied to this whole major release.
Right. So it's not like 3.0 is going to have a whole bunch of new APIs and that's how we're going to get these new features.
Like if the second half of the router APIs land in, 2.16 or 2.17, they'll just get there. Otherwise it'll be 3.1 or 3.2. It doesn't really matter. It's not really tied to one or the other.
Yeah.
That's great.
It makes our jobs as developers, especially like, as developers, we don't really get a lot of time to do maintenance.
Yeah.
There's often pressure for bug fixes and feature development.
Yeah.
So I think things like this make our job easy. And that's one of the reasons I love Ember.
Yeah, same. I think Rails 5 beta was in beta for like a year or something like that.
The Rails betas, Rails is always in beta for a while. And it's like beta, release candidate 1, release candidate 2.
Yeah.
But I mean, it makes sense. You're going to have a whole bunch of new APIs in those versions, so you're going to want to test your applications. You're going to want to know about this stuff before you upgrade.
Yeah.
So with Ember, not so much.
Yeah, it's great, and it's really the kind of thing that does make Ember really good for teams for long-term application development. It's the kind of stuff that's not really going to get sung about a ton. Maybe it's not like the new hot thing.
No, of course not. You want to hear about how in JavaScript framework 4.0 that server-side rendering is just automatically built in and all you have to do is upgrade. But
right.
the reality is
you're leaving people behind if you move fast in certain ways or you don't consider the existing applications.
Exactly. And any framework that's going to make big promises like that is going to have a whole bunch of breaking changes. What you said, leave people behind.
Right. Cool.
So you made some cool modals this week, huh? Yes.
I was working with Modal Dialog, one of my favorite add-ons. I've worked with it a lot over the last couple of years, but it's fun to get. It's always there's always like a little challenge to wrap it in a specific kind of application specific modal and get it to do exactly what you want to do. But once you do, it's really nice. And I feel like I've gotten almost all the way there in the past, but the animations is kind of where it's been tough, and especially animating out because when you destroy a view in Ember, that all happens synchronously. Ember gets rid of it, throws it away, and draws the next screen, and so you don't have control over that process. Whereas with CSS animations and animating in, you have control just because it renders it synchronously, but you can start out at 0 opacity and fade it in. But on destroy, it just goes away instantly, so you don't even have that chance. With Liquid Fire, the strategy is to basically have a copy of this destroying element, and then you have a chance to do something with it. And so there's never been a good bridge between Liquid Fire and Modal Dialog, and they just don't work together the way Liquid Fire works with other components in Ember. But Chris, the guy who spoke at Ember NYC, works on this add-on called Liquid Tether. And Liquid Tether is kind of exactly this idea. It tries to marry the two concepts of liquid fire and modal dialogue. So yeah, I was working on some stuff and I really wanted to animate out. So it was finally kind of time for me to dive into this, and it ended up being pretty simple.
Awesome. I know we're doing a podcast, but it looks amazing. It's one of the coolest modal animations I've ever seen. And it's not advanced. It's just like silky, buttery smooth.
Yeah. I wanted, we were working like an invitation flow. And so it's something you would see maybe when you first joined a new app on iOS and you just have like full page invitation sheets that are like panning between each other. And so I wanted something really simple, and none of the pre-existing liquid fire transitions worked. So I just wrote a simple one, fade to white, which fades away the thing and kind of puts a cover over it and then bleeds into the new view. And it was like super easy. And then my modal dialogue, the newest version of modal dialogue, if you have Liquid Tether installed, it automatically uses that under the hood instead of Tether dialogue, which uses Ember Tether, the unanimated version of it. And so, once I got a few settings configured, it was basically a drop-in replacement. And then you update the transition map in Liquid Fire, and then like your modals just do this cool fade to white thing.
How does your modal know which transition to use in the transition map?
Yeah, so this is the one thing I still find a little bit awkward about the API, but the way I'm doing it is it goes back to the global transitions.js map, which is just a file that comes with Liquid Fire. So I think the idea here originally was like Liquid Fire, one of the main use cases was animating routes. And just like we have a router map, and you want a map because you want the first match to win. And then you want to have like catch-all routes, or basically that's how you need to do it when you're defining that. And so if you wanted to do something similar where you're saying like what transitions apply to which route transitions, you would also want a map to define the hierarchy. And so the map lets you define rules that say, if this element has this class, if this route has this name, apply this transition. And so what I did was, after installing Liquid Tether, I gave the modal that I wanted to have this fade to white transition, just like a UI modal -- fade to white class. And then I just added a rule to the transitions map that said, anything that has that, use my new fade to white transition.
Gotcha.
And then I did another one that just said use fade for everything else. So like all of our modals, like our app specific modals have like a UI modal class. And I just said, if you just have UI modal, use fade.
So this is where the first one wins thing comes in. So if I have fade to white, that's going to be defined above.
Exactly. And even though those have UI modal as well, they match that one first, so they use fade to white.
Awesome.
Which is kind of cool. So like part of me is like, it's cool because you have these global rules and then all of my modals get it. But part of me wishes I just could define it locally on the component.
Yeah, it's
like
almost
a transition.
Like you want the animation like co-located with the thing it's animating.
Exactly. And then if you happen to need to share an animation, you could like hoist it up and share it in another way, like maybe just importing a module or a function. I think I would prefer that. But it still was pretty easy to get going, and like it makes sense once you understand where the origin comes from.
Nice. How was writing the fade to white animation code in Liquid Fire? Like, how was that?
That was an exercise in like a blind man leading the blind. That's what I felt like talking with myself about it. No, I went to the predefined transitions and copied the fade one, which is, I knew I wanted aspects of that. It handles a lot more out of the box, and I just wanted something really simple that worked for our use case. You know, it's cool. It's like I need to do a deep dive into this so I really understand it. I haven't yet. And so I was just kind of just finding my way through. But it's a promise-based API. Liquid Fire uses Velocity under the hood, which is an animation library based on promises. So you can say, animate the opacity from 0 to 50 over a span of 250 milliseconds. And then you can call .then on it. And then you can say, wait 1,000 seconds, and then .then animate in my new element or whatever. Or animate the left position or the top position, whatever you want to do. And you can just string these together. It's pretty cool. And whatever you return, the promise chain that you return from your transition, Liquid Fire automatically applies and just waits. So like if you're transitioning across routes, or if you're destroying or creating a component and it uses that transition, it just waits the entire promise and to make sure it works, which is cool for debugging too, because like you can return like infinite waiters in the middle of the promise chain and like see how it looks at each step. So I really like the promise API. It's just that some of the other APIs, I'm just not as familiar with them, but it was pretty easy to get it to do what I wanted to do. And it's fun to feel empowered like that.
Nice. How, so you said that like when Ember destroys a component, it's like, that's it, just gets removed from the DOM. How does this work with Liquid Fire then? What does Liquid Fire do so the component, you have an opportunity to animate that component away?
Yeah, today I was working on another transition and I put like 100,000 second waiter in just because I was having some styling issues. And I noticed that there was 2 of them. So I think I'm not exactly sure the technical details of Liquid Fire, but the Liquid Tether implementation that's on top, they have like a global container for your Liquid Tether modals, and there's 2 of them, and one of them said like Liquid Tether, and the other one said Liquid Tether is -- is animating, and the original one had like visibility hidden, and the second one was like getting velocity animations on it. So it was like changing the opacity and stuff. So I think it makes a copy, applies your transition, and I'm not sure if it notifies like if Ember's rendering layer is aware that that's going on, but I don't think it is. I think Ember just does its thing synchronously or in the next tick of the run loop, and it just carries on its merry way. But the new view and the old view, which you have access to in your transition, don't end up in their final spot until you say so. And so from the user's perspective, the thing is halting, even if Ember thinks it's already rendered everything it needs to render.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yep, totally.
So I think that's how it worked, but it would be really interesting to do a deeper dive, or maybe even have Edward talk about it, because I would love to learn about that. And I know he has some ideas for how he could improve some of those primitives as well, some things he's worked on with other Ember animation stuff. But yeah, it's all, needless to say, it's like really interesting stuff. It's super exciting too. So
awesome. Yeah, it looks amazing.
Thanks. Cool. I guess that's all we have time for today. Nice chatting with you, and I will see you at work in about 5 minutes, and tomorrow as well, and probably the next day as well.
Awesome. Well, the next day is Saturday. You will not see me at work on Saturday.
That's good. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. See you next time.